Hello everyone, how's it going? Billy Ballgame here, back with another video. On this channel, I'm just a dude who loves to talk about baseball cards. So bear with me if you would on this video. I'm using a new setup. My wife got me a webcam for Father's Day, so I'm using a new webcam and her computer to do this video for the first time. So this is actually my second attempt, because the first attempt I filmed like a 30-minute video and realized I wasn't sharing my screen. So I'm going to try this again, and hopefully I can get it right this time. But the general purpose of today's video is I wanted to give you guys kind of a glimpse into my process on how I go about purchasing what I consider a bigger card for my collection. So I'm going to walk you through that process today, and I'm going to go into VCP. I'm going to pull up a few cards, show you the different ranges and the different between grades and the difference in prices between SGC and PSA, and kind of show you what I look for as far as my budget goes and how that determines the grade of the card that I buy. Because if you watched my collaboration with Greg from Midlife Cards and Adam from Vintage Sanctuary, we talked about how budget dictates what grade you buy that card in. And so for me, as you all know, I consider myself a budget collector, and budget is the most important kind of consideration for me when it comes to buying cards. And if you have a $2,000 a month budget, your budget still comes into play. If you have a $50 a month budget, your budget still comes into play. So I kind of want to give you some insight into my process on how I purchase cards today. Now, again, this is just how I do things. I don't have the market cornered in good ideas by any means. And as a matter of fact, some of you that watch this video may be able to give me some pointers on how I can tweak and adjust my process and make it better. Because again, I'm just a dude that loves to talk about baseball cards and just happens to have a YouTube channel. That doesn't mean that I'm the greatest collector that's ever walked the earth and that I have better ideas of how to do things than any of you do. So before I get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I wanted to show you an item real quick. So as you can see, this is my new logo, courtesy of Scott from Reindeer Studios, that I'm wearing on this t-shirt. So my wife and I had a few t-shirts made that I wanted to show you. And thanks again to Scott from Reindeer Studios for making my logo, because he did a tremendous job. And I hope that this shows up on the screen. But there's the front. And then on the back, it has "I'm just a dude who loves to talk about baseball cards," with the font on there that Scott made for the logo. And I'll be wearing these at the National. So again, if you see me there, please don't hesitate to come up and introduce yourself and say hi. I'd be happy to meet as many of you as I possibly can. And I'll probably be hanging out with my buddy Chris from Missouri while we're there, because we have 2.5 days on the floor, and he's been to several nationals. So this will be my first real national that I can count, because like I've said before, I think I went to one when I was in high school, but I had about a $10 budget. We stood in line most of the time waiting on autograph St. Louis Blues players. And we didn't really spend a whole lot of time on the floor, and we definitely didn't spend a lot of money on the floor. So this will be my first big boy national. But I will go ahead and get into the video. So those of you that have been around the channel for a while, you know that hopefully this works this time. You know that I have 4 cards that I'm mainly focused on, or 4 cards that are on my list for the National. And that list is, I'm adding some other cards to it. But sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. There we go. That's better. So I've had 4 cards on the list for a while. But I've added some other cards to the list, and it just depends really on what cards I can find at the National, what kind of prices I find those cards in. So I wanted to give myself a little bit more flexibility when it comes to what cards I can pick up at the National. But first, what I wanted to show you is the Willie McCovey rookie from the 60 top set, because most of you that have been around the channel for a while know that I'm working on a 1960 top set. And the Willie McCovey rookie is really one of the biggest cards that I have left that I need to add for the set. And I haven't picked it up yet. And I've been looking at these cards, quite a bit for the last 6-8 months or so, and just haven't pulled the trigger on one. So if you're not familiar with VCP, again, thanks to my buddy Chris from Missouri, because he's the one that kind of tuned me into this website. And it's a great website. Like, you can build your collection in here. It tracks its value. It tracks what you paid. It tracks what the card is worth. It has all the most recent sales and all that stuff. It's a great tool that I use almost on a daily basis. So as you can see, I pulled up the Willie McCovey rookie card from 1960 Topps. And as you all know, I like mid-grade cards. I like 5s and 6s whenever I can afford them, especially from cards from the 60s. Now, as you move forward or backwards in decades, what I consider a mid-range card for that decade, it's kind of a sliding scale. But for the 60s, kind of my sweet spot are 5s and 6s, like I said, when I can afford them. So you can look right here. Here's a PSA 5. Current VCP average value is $172. An SGC 5 is currently $149. Now, if you go up to a 5.5, SGC is $179. PSA is $245. If you go up to a 6, that flips. SGC is $286. PSA is $267. So based off of these prices, and a few months ago when I was looking at these, 5s were going for much, much closer to the current 6 price. So these cards have come down quite a bit recently. But knowing that 5s and 6s are kind of in my sweet spot, this is a cheap enough card to where I would consider a 6. And if I were to consider a 6, I would look at a PSA 6 because it's $20 cheaper. If I were looking at a 5, I would look at an SGC 5 because it's $20 cheaper. And so for this card with the eye appeal that I want and the most bang for my buck, I would look at the 5 or 6 range on these cards. And I would look for the best version of that card that I could find. Now, in all these cards that I'll show you here, as you move up the scale, at some point, there's a big jump between grades in every single one of these cards that I'm going to show you. And on this card, it's from a 6.5 to a 7 in SGC, and it's from a 6.5 to a 7 in PSA. And a lot of the times, and this isn't always the case, but what I've noticed is a lot of the times it goes at a big jump from a 6, which would be a collector grade, to a 7, which would be an investor grade for cards in the 60s. And then, from cards in the 50s, of course, that would be from a 5 to a 6. Now, it doesn't always work that way. But when I look at the different spread in cards or prices based off of the grade, like, I could easily afford within my budget an SGC 6.5 or a PSA 6.5, but I'm not going to spend $800 to jump to a 7, like that's more than double from a PSA 6.5 to a PSA 7. And excuse me, on SGC, it's almost double from a 6.5 to a 7. And for not, I mean, Willie McCovey's a great player, but to me, like I can't justify spending $600 and especially almost $800 for a Willie McCovey rookie card in a 7 when I can get a 6 for half the price, right? So these cards, the McCovey rookie has come down far enough to where I would consider a 6. But if I found an SGC 5.5 or an SGC 5 that I felt had good eye appeal, it was well centered, it had a nice surface, like not a lot of fish eyes or print dots, the color was nice, the registration was nice, like I would consider I would go with an SGC 5 if I could find a nice one, pay $150 and call it a day. And then I'm saving $130 between a 5 and a 6. So that's kind of what I would be looking at with the Willie Mays rookie. And then I'll pull up a Mike Schmidt rookie. Shout out to my buddy Ray from Philly, because it's a little bit of a different card. And then this way I can give you kind of a range of cards that I'm looking at. So the Mike Schmidt rookie, as we all know, is probably the biggest rookie card in the 70s. And this is definitely a card that's on my list to buy, but it'll probably be a little while because I want to work through, you know, a lot of the cards from the 50s and 60s before I start going to cards in the 70s. Now, if we back this down, the scale kind of slides because we're dealing with the 70s now. Now I would look primarily at 6s and 7s when I'm dealing with a card from the 70s. Now, you can see here a 6. If you can find a nice version of a 6, it's going to be a sharp card. And in SGC, it's $235, whereas PSA, it's $270. So I would already be looking at SGC. And again, same way here, 6.5 in SGC is what, $50, $60 cheaper than a PSA 6.5. An SGC 7 is actually cheaper than a PSA 7. A 7.5, there's not a huge jump there between an SGC 7 and an SGC 7.5, but there's over $100 jump in PSA to a 7.5. But really where the big jump is when you go from a 7.5 to an 8, you're looking at $480 more in PSA. And on SGC, you're looking at $300 roughly. So there's no way I'm going to jump to an 8 here. So in this card, what I would consider is a 7 or a 7.5 because it's relatively affordable. And it's going to be a really sharp card. Like on a 7, you're maybe going to have a touch on a corner or two, right? But it's a mint card. And me being almost 50 and my near vision not being what it once was, like this would look like a mint card to me. So I would be, you know, perfectly content with a 7 or a 7.5. If I could find a really nice eye appeal version of a 6.5 or a 6, then I would buy that and save money. But I would probably, this is just me personally, I would steer away from a PSA 7.5. I would consider a PSA 7 because they're only $15 difference. Or actually, no, sorry, that was 7.5 to 7. So, but there's still about a $50 difference. So SGC 7.5, I would look at, not PSA 7.5 so much. SGC 7 and PSA 7. I would probably want to steer toward an SGC 6.5 as opposed to an PSA 6.5. And then the same way with a 6. But more than likely, for the price and the bang for the buck within my collection, I would probably look right here, 7, 7.5. These three would be kind of right in my sweet spot. So, and what I like in eye appeal, as you all know, is I like centered cards. I like bright colors. I like good registration and a clean surface. And in a 7, maybe a print dot or a fisheye is what's knocking the card down to a 7 from an 8. So again, there are variables in there, but generally speaking, that's kind of what I look for in eye appeal. So I'll go ahead and go back to some of the other cards that you've heard me talk about on my channel that I'm going to target at the National. So I'm going to pull up the Bob Gibson rookie. And again, it's kind of a sliding scale because we're bumped back into the 50s now. So here, normally I would look in the 4, 5, and 6 range. I would be happy with a nice eye appeal 4 all day long on this card. But if you move up, what you notice is PSA is actually cheaper than SGC at a 5. But then it flips, a 5.5. PSA is more than a 5, or than an SGC 5.5. And then if you go to 6, SGC is more expensive than PSA. So this card, if I were looking at a 6, which I don't know if I would want to stretch my budget that high and justify roughly $1,000 for this card at the National, I would look at a PSA 6. I would look at an SGC 5.5. I would look at a PSA or an SGC 5. And that's probably the range that I'll want to stay in, is a PSA or an SGC 5. And again, it'll have to be a really nice example for a 5, well centered. I like the darker pink versions, and I'll show you some that have sold here recently where there's darker pink and lighter pink on the card. For some reason, I just like that darker pink color. I just think it looks better. I think the colors look brighter. But here's the big jump where you go from a 6 to a 6.5. It's not that much, $180. But then when you go to a 7, you're talking about $1,000 difference. PSA goes from 977 to 1,300, but it's been a long time since one is sold in a PSA 6.5. But look at the jump again with a 7. So for me, what I'll do is I look to buy the closest grade that I can reasonably afford to this jump. Okay, so in SGC, it would be a 5.5. But more than likely, it'll be a PSA 5, an SGC 5, or an SGC 5.5 is what I would be looking for. Because again, it's a pretty big jump from a 5.5 to a 6, and then a 6 to a 6.5 isn't bad, but then a big jump to a 7. So this would be the range that I would be looking at right here for this card. So now I will go to, let me show you what I'm talking about with the coloring. This first one is really nice. If it's the right one. No, that's not it. See, that's the lighter pink. This one is really nice. Darker pink, very well centered, but they're paying 6.5 prices for this SGC 5. So this is a really nice example, but I wouldn't want to pay $450 more than the average VCP price for this card, even though it's really nice. If I were going to spend this much, I would look at buying a 6 or 6.5. But this is really sharp for a 5. If they weren't so expensive, that would be a card that I would consider. If I could find that card at the National closer to the average price, let's say $800-900, then I would buy this card if I found a similar example at the National. This one's better centered than the first one I showed. It has the nice darker pink, and it's a whole lot cheaper. So like I would rather have this card than this card without a doubt, especially for what, $150 difference. So that's kind of what I would look for in the Bob Gibson. And again, this just kind of gives you a general idea of what suits my eye as far as eye appeal goes. And then another one that you guys have heard me talk about is the Nolan Ryan. Sorry, VCP is being kind of slow right now. Here it comes. So this is a big card to me. I've been in love with this card since probably 7th grade. One of my buddies brought one into shop class, and it was worth about $100 at the time. But $100, sorry, my dogs are going nuts upstairs. $100 may as well have been $1 million at the time. And I'm a huge fan of Nolan Ryan. He's one of my favorite players, and this is a really big card to me. And as we all know, one of the most expensive rookie cards of the 60s. So I would go down here to the 5 or 6 range. And you can see here a PSA 5 is 1,071. And SGC 5 is 861. So I like that. Then we go to 5.5, and they're both pretty close, but still they're over $1,000. SGC 6 is quite a bit cheaper than PSA 6 for sure. And then there's a spread there, $500 almost between a 6 and a 6.5, and then 450 or so between an SGC 6 and a 6.5. But then look at the jump to a 7. You're talking about almost $800 there. And then here you're talking about almost $1,000. So again, I want to buy the nicest version that I can afford within my budget. But this card just, it gets too expensive for me. Like I would consider a 6, but that would be a big chunk of my budget at the National, and it would have to be a really, really sharp example of a 6. So here I would be leaning right away at an SGC 5, and it's still going to be a sharp card. Like some of these have sold recently that are super sharp. If I could find these cards for this price, like I would buy them all day. There's no way I'm going to jump to a 7. It's just too big of a jump, and it's too expensive of a card. Same way with a 6.5. So really the most I could think about spending on this card would be in a 6 at $1,200, but that's still a lot more than I would like to spend. So for me, an SGC 5 on this card would be right in my sweet spot. And I'll show you a really nice example of one that sold not too long ago. So this is it. This one sold for $935. And the VCP average price right now is 830 something, I think. So this is a card that I would definitely pay up $100 more above the average price to buy, just because it's such a well-centered, nice, clean example to me. So if you, sorry, my screen's got a bunch of gunk on it. I just realized. So it has a little bit of fuzzy corners, right? Which doesn't bother me in the least, because I'm not even going to be able to see that without zooming in on it. And I don't zoom in on cards after I evaluate them for grading, submit them for grading, and then get the grades back. Like once I evaluate them for grading, I don't ever magnify or loop a card anymore after that. So like this card would be great. Like I would be more than happy to have this example of a 68 Nolan Ryan. Then if we look, and so that one sold toward the end of May. Here's another one, and this one's pretty sharp, but it's off-centered from left to right, or from top to bottom. Now, you'll see in the next one that top to bottom centering on these horizontal cards don't bother me as much as left to right centering. So this is one that I would consider, and it's below the average value or average price right now on VCP. So this next one, you can see it's off left to right and top to bottom, and it's got a slant. It's got a tilt to it. And that's probably why it's the cheapest of the three. For me, this isn't a card that would meet my eye appeal. This isn't a card that I would necessarily look to buy. Now, I would buy it if I got, you know, a super good deal on it. But I think the centering, especially left to right, in this case, top to bottom, and then that tilt to it is enough to where it would bug me. So this isn't a card really that I would look at. Now, the corners are sharper. So the off centering and the tilt is probably why this is graded a 5. So that's kind of my thoughts on the Nolan Ryan. And then I'll pull one more card up and wrap it up from here. I'll pull up the 1933 Goudey Rogers Hornsby. Now, again, I like to be at collector grade whenever I can, but the cost of the card dictates that. So, you know, for example, and maybe it would be considered a collector grade, a T206 that was from 1911 in a 1 technically would be collector grade in a Ty Cobb, for example, and that's all I would be able to afford anyway. So with the Hornsby, 3 is a collector grade technically. Now, again, that's not a hard and fast rule, and I think a lot of times collector grade and investor grade are overutilized and overstated. But again, that's just my opinion. So what I see immediately is PSA generally is more expensive than SGC until you get to a 4. And SGC is more than a PSA and a 4, but not by a whole lot. So where is the big jump in this card? When you go from a 4 or a 4.5 to a 5, at least in SGC, you're talking about over $1,000. You're talking about $1,300 from a 4 to a 5. And in PSA or in SGC, not as many have sold in, you know, higher grades. But to go from a 3 to a 4, you're looking at what, almost $600, $500, somewhere around there. And in a 2 to a 3, you're looking at 130 in SGC. Here you're looking at almost 200, about 180. So right away, an SGC 2 or an SGC 3 would be where I'm kind of looking, because a PSA 3 is $739 VCP average price. For me, I would rather, you know, save that money, buy the same quality card in an SGC 3. And I'll pull some up here and show you. Now, again, this card's almost 100 years old. So to me, like, would I like to have a 7 or an 8? Yeah, but I can't afford that, number one. Number two, it's a 100-year-old card almost. Like, it should have some dings. It should maybe have some rounded corners or maybe even a crease. You know, you guys know that I'm not a big fan of creases, but if I were to buy, you know, a red portrait Cobb in a T206 in a 1, it's probably going to have some creases. And that's over 100-year-old card. And so as long as it wasn't across his face or split the card in half, like it really wouldn't bother me, just because the cost of the card and its age, right? So really on a 3, like if there were a crease, like this one might have a crease, it's kind of in the corner, kind of. It doesn't go into his hat. It doesn't go into his face. Like, in this case, the crease wouldn't bother me just because of what the card is. But now this example, I wouldn't pay $780 for. I wouldn't pay this far above VCP average price because of the centering. Now, these cards are hard to find centered, and when you do, there's going to be a premium. So for a better price, I may be willing to overlook the centering. generally, to me, it has pretty good eye appeal, but I'm not a fan of the centering on that one. And then the previous one goes all the way back to January when it sold, and the centering is relatively similar to the last one. And again, it's sold at about the same price, $720. And then the next one, to me, this is the best of the three, and it's $200 cheaper. And maybe part of that is because of the auction, because this is, well, I don't know, because this is fixed price, buy it now versus Heritage. But man, for $200, like, I'll take this one all day over the other two. The centering, of course, the corners around it, it's a 3. It's almost a 100-year-old card, but there are no creases in it. There might be a little something right there on that edge, but I wouldn't be able to make that out with the naked eye anyway. And so for the money, I would save $200 and buy this card all day. So let me go ahead and flip the view back here, and hopefully that whole thing worked this time. But so I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into how I look to purchase cards. And again, I don't have the market corner on good ideas. If someone has another process out there that they use that can help me tweak mine, like, feel free to put it in the comments. I'm always looking to improve, how I get the best bang for my buck in my collection. So again, I'm always open to new ideas. And hopefully some of you got some value out of this, and again, kind of gave you a peek into how my feeble brain works, and into my process of how I buy cards. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. It's going to be a little bit longer, but I wanted to try out this new setup and share the screen and all this other stuff. So hopefully there's still some value here for you all. And again, if you see me at the National, please feel free to come up and say hi. I'll probably be spending a lot of time with Chris because we have 2.5 days on the show, or at the show on the floor. I'll also be at the YouTube meet and greet. And I really look forward to meeting, a lot of my YouTube buddies. But again, if you're not on YouTube, please don't hesitate to come up and say hi. I look forward to meeting as many of you there as I can. But I guess I'll wrap it up with that. So until the next time, I hope everybody has a good one, and I'll talk to you later. Oh, and while I'm doing this, if you're still with me, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But that's going to do it. So have a good one.